Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be carrying on with the French Revolution, and we're going to be looking at part 3 of 4. And today's lecture is going to revolve around the figure of Napoleon. A little bit of a long question here, but the question is nationalism, that is the popular will, was becoming increasingly important in the late 18th and early 19th century, both inside and outside of France. How was Napoleon successful in using it? How was he unsuccessful? Gives examples. Okay, so this lecture is going to revolve around Napoleon, but the main focus as we talk about this, I'd like you to think about this idea of nationalism. It's going to be a really, really important idea moving forward. You really can't understand the 19th and really the 20th century without understanding nationalism. And we've looked at it a little bit already. We saw with our friend Rousseau, he was big into the popular will, the general will. We saw that the Jacobins last time were very skillful at using it to their advantage. This idea that it's in the people that sovereignty resides, this idea that it's the will of the people, right? And we've seen this a couple of times. We're going to see that Napoleon is a master at manipulating this, but he's also going to get bitten by it. So let's take a look at things. And the last time we met, we had talked about the Directory. Well, actually, we didn't talk about the Directory, but we mentioned that the Jacobins had been overthrown. Okay, so you remember the Jacobins had engaged in the terror, and it was a time of a bit of upheaval. Everybody was a little bit, afraid to see what was going to happen. And we ended last lecture with Robespierre getting beheaded. There's a coup d'etat against the Jacobins, and a new, more moderate government comes in. Well, this new moderate government was called the Directory. It was going to rule France from 1795 to 1799. It was going to be bourgeois in orientation. Okay. Now, France was still going to be a republic because, well, the king was dead. And they didn't have any plans on making a new king. So it was bourgeois. It was going to be a republic, but it was not going to be democratic. In other words, the conclusion that many of these people drew was the conclusion that the earlier National Assembly drew, which was that the common people just aren't ready to rule yet. The Jacobins, to them, was case in point, too easily riled up, probably interested in the money of the bourgeoisie. We saw that in the Law of Maxims that was passed on the Jacobins, this attempt to regulate the free market. There was also this, higher taxes. And so the folks in the Directory, did away with all that, brought back the free market, and ended democracy. And so it was a more stable, more moderate government, maybe something akin to the original Constitution. But it was immediately beset with problems. One is that France was still in a state of war, and wars often bring hard economic times with them. And times were hard. And so there was a lot of working class resentment. Many in the working class longed for the days of the Jacobins. The price of bread was high again. Bring back the Jacobins. Also, socially, it didn't have a broad base of support in France. They had limited the franchise. That is, they had limited the right to vote to only propertied men. And so there were big parts of France that didn't have property, and they were resentful. In addition to that, there were a lot of people in France of property who didn't like the Directory. And we're talking about very conservative people, nobles, those that were left or those outside of France, didn't identify with this. To them, this was a bourgeois type of thing. It was still revolutionary. It was still too radical for their taste. And quite frankly, there was a lot of people who wanted to bring back the monarchy. Okay. And so this directory has problems both from the left and from the right. The poor and the working class you long for the days of the Jacobins again, and conservatives, nobles, monarchists, people like that want to bring back the old system altogether. And so it's got a very narrow base of support. And so increasingly, the Directory had to deal with uprisings. Sometimes it would be Jacobin uprisings, the sans-culottes trying to bring back a Jacobin government. Sometimes it would be monarchist uprisings. And increasingly, the Directory has to rely on the army, keep calling in the army to quell these rebellions. Until in 1799, November 9th of 1799, finally the army stepped in altogether and did away with the Directory in another coup d'etat. Coup d'etat, of course, is when there's a violent overthrow of an existing government, usually by the army. Well, initially, this was going to be a three-man dictatorship. One of these was Napoleon. And so Napoleon was brought in as a military man. He was younger. And so the other people thought, just having him there would be good because he was widely respected as a military hero in France. He'd already done some exploits, and so they figured it would be someone they could control, but they were pretty wrong because Napoleon would eventually make himself the sole dictator of France. And so what I want to do is I want to look at Napoleon, take a little bit of a look at him. Nowadays, we don't often talk about Napoleon, and he's not really appreciated as a historical figure the way he once was. But there was a time, particularly in the 19th century and maybe the early 20th century, where Napoleon was looked upon as one of the great men of history. Right up there with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. But unlike these two individuals who were born into some sort of privilege, Napoleon was really a man of the people in a sense because he had risen from pretty humble background. He was born on an island called Corsica, which was in the Mediterranean. At the time of Napoleon's birth, it had recently become French. He was born in the 1760s, I believe. It had recently become French. And it was really more Italian than French. And so Napoleon always had an accent, but much more than that, Napoleon was born into pretty humble circumstances. And so he was looked upon as a bit of an iconic figure because he was someone who was born into humble circumstances, but had risen not only to the top of France, but just to become emperor of all Europe. He had risen even further than any king had ever risen. And so he was looked at and honored. He was an object of fascination for many, many people in the 19th century. A lot of legends surrounding him and what have you. In reality, though, Napoleon was a bit of a cynical character. He was a bit Machiavellian, if you know what that means. Essentially, Napoleon's entire life was about his ambition, about getting into power. He was a very talented, a genius sort of individual, and his entire life's ambition was power. And so I want to read a couple of quotes by Napoleon. He once told a friend, "Friendship is only a word. I care for nobody." It's kind of an odd thing to tell your friend, but apparently that was Napoleon's philosophy on things. Here's another one. Napoleon was occasionally noted for flying into a rage around subordinates. But he once confided in someone that he often simulated anger. In other words, he wasn't really angry. He just did it to inspire fear. Quote, Otherwise, they would come and bite me in the hand. And so he wasn't above acting angry in order to scare and intimidate people. Now, Napoleon was an atheist, but he was, ironically, an admirer of religion, but not in the traditional sense. His views on religion. Quote, "In religion, I do not see the mystery of the incarnation. The incarnation's the birth of Christ. But the mystery of the social order. The people need a religion. This must be in the hands of the government." So, in other words, religion is very useful and it's a great tool of the government. And so we can see that maybe Napoleon's a bit cynical about things. He's willing to use whatever means necessary to get into power. Now, the late 18th century was a time of constitutional government and will of the people, but Napoleon ruled, his style of rule once he got into power was that of an absolute despot. He totally did not believe in popular sovereignty, thought that it was a very foolish idea, but Napoleon recognized that the will of the people was a powerful force, and that if he wanted to stay in power, he was going to have to make it appear as if he was a man of the people. And so he attempted to mold public opinion. He's the first ruler to realize that the will of the people is important. Things had changed, with the coming of the French Revolution, but that the will of the people could be molded. All right, and we're going to see he uses several things to do that. Another thing Napoleon recognized that France was a very, very divided country. By the time he had come to power, it had been torn apart for 11 years of revolution and war. There were so many factions from right to left. All of them hated each other. The reason the Directory had failed is because it had such a narrow base of support. And Napoleon knew that if he didn't broaden his own support, if he didn't start to reconcile people who were hostile, then he would be next. There would be another coup d'etat, and he would be the next one who would be toppled. All right? And so he was actually pretty tolerant toward a lot of groups that previously had been cast off by the revolution. So monarchists and emigres and nobles. Napoleon most immediately began to try to win over some of the harshest critics of the revolution. Obviously not because he cared about them, but because he knew he was going to have to. All right. Well, one of the things that Napoleon did is he was a great centralizer. This is something that had been happening in France for a long time. As feudalism disintegrated, the central government, the monarchy at first, became more popular and more powerful. Napoleon took this process and put it on steroids. He really centralized the government, really ruled as an absolute dictator. All bureaucrats, all members of the government were selected by him and appointed by him. And so he really kept a tight control over the entire country, right down to the local level. The local officials were answerable to Napoleon. Tax collecting, law, you name it. Napoleon had a tight control over the entire nation. Napoleon also was a master of propaganda. As we said, he realized the will of the people was an important thing, and if channeled properly, it could be something that would really propel him into power. And so he was very skillful at using the press. This was a new thing. Old regimes, absolute monarchs, didn't tend to do this. They didn't, they may have tolerated a press to some degree or another, but they never tried to control and manipulate it. But Napoleon's a new type of ruler, and he recognizes that the press is vital, right? It's the way that people are getting their information. Not only that, but under Napoleon, schools became controlled by the state rather than by the church. And these schools were little nurseries of patriotism or pro-Napoleonism, I guess we should say. Uh, you know, uh, Teaching the young, the virtues of the state and of the emperor who controls the state. Well, Napoleon, as we said, recognized information was power, but he also recognized that information could be used against him. And so, under Napoleon, censorship returned with a vengeance, much more so than it had ever existed under the Bourbon family, under the old kings of France. There were drastic curbs on freedom of expression, on the freedom to publish. Newspapers that were hostile to Napoleon were were shut down, boarded up, and Napoleon used a very large and extensive police force to monitor groups and publications to ensure that none of them were plotting an overthrow. Well, as I mentioned, a big part of Napoleon's strategy for maintaining power was reaching out to groups who had previously been hostile. Probably the biggest and the most hostile group in France had been the Catholic Church. You'll recall that the Catholic Church had never been on board with the revolution. After all, the revolution started by depriving the church of land, depriving them of their old authority, by depriving them of the tithe, the way they used to get money, and making all priests swear an oath of loyalty to the state. We saw last time that many priests had refused to do that and instead had taken up arms against the state. And so um, all governments in France had to deal with this, big peasant uprisings and renegade priests and so on and so forth. It's important to remember, too, that something like 90% of France was pretty loyal to the Catholic Church, or at least nominally loyal to the Catholic Church, regarded themselves as Catholics. And so this was a group that Napoleon really wanted to reach out to. If you're trying to run an organization and you could win 90% of the organization over to you, then that might be a good avenue to pursue. And so Napoleon began to reach out to the Pope. The Pope had been, completely cut off during the time of the Revolution, and Napoleon began to reach out to him. And they began to negotiate on, how they could get the Pope's blessing for Napoleon and his regime. Now, the Pope, for his part, wanted things restored back to the way they were. The church to get its lands back and Catholicism to become the official religion again. And Napoleon wasn't going to have that. He wasn't going to give the Pope everything he wanted or even most of what he wanted. Napoleon rather worked out a compromise with the Pope. The Pope the Pope wanted Catholicism to be the official religion of the revolution. Napoleon had him compromise at the, quote, religion of the vast majority of French people. The Pope wanted the right to nominate high churchmen, right? The popes had always had that authority. And Napoleon said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to nominate them, but you can bless them. And so on and so forth down the line. He gave the church a little of what it wanted, which was better than what it had, which was nothing. And Napoleon always had the trump card that he had a big military force in Italy. And so that the Pope should deal wisely with him, a veiled threat of sorts. Well, anyways, he was able to give the Pope enough of what he wanted. And in 1800, the Pope signed what is called the Concordat. Essentially, this gave the Pope's blessing to the revolution. And in a stroke of the pen, Napoleon was able to win all of these Catholics to his rule. The Pope had blessed his reign, his regime, and so he was able to win back all of these Catholics. And so, naturally, this helped his popularity a lot. A group that was maybe not feeling good about Napoleon too were the bourgeoisie. Remember, he had toppled their directory, their government. He had curbed civil liberties. This is something the bourgeoisie are always into. Um, he had been acting like a dictator. This is not in line with the Enlightenment liberal ideas that the bourgeoisie tended to have. But Napoleon was smart because he knew as much as the bourgeoisie liked freedom and civil liberties and that sort of thing, they were much more um, into money than anything else. And so, under Napoleon, the French economy began to thrive, especially as he began to take over other places, as we'll see in a bit. Um, he was generally pro business. And so, under Napoleon, the bourgeoisie, even if they had lost some of their civil liberties, the economy was never better, and many of them were more than happy to settle for that. Another thing he did is he gave the bourgeoisie a dream, something that they had been dreaming for a long time. Going back to feudal times, France had always been a mishmash of different laws. France had always been a mishmash of different jurisdictions, a gigantic mess, really, of different localities and manners and laws, something that for ages the bourgeoisie had complained about. It had been a dream of the Enlightenment to create one grand, enlightened set of laws that would enshrine liberty and property and all the ideals of the Enlightenment, one set of laws for the entirety of France. Well, Napoleon gave that to them in 1804. Um, this code of laws, sometimes called the Napoleonic Code, it protected private property. Um, it 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 and it protected people's professions. You could choose the profession you wanted. Did away with the labor unions and the guilds and monopolies and all those things that the bourgeoisie hated. It also enshrined in law this idea of equality before the law, religious liberty, and all of these things that the Enlightenment um, had really argued for. It's a wonder, how much of this was, even with a set of laws, when you have an absolute dictator like Napoleon, even if you have the best laws, you wonder, how protected things are in actuality, but he did give it to them. And so feudalism and whatnot was finally outlawed. Napoleon was also really skillful at using what's called a plebiscite. A plebiscite isn't a word we use too much, but you're probably familiar with the concept. Plebiscite is basically a vote of the people. All right. Um, in our government, generally we don't vote on laws. We vote on representatives who go to Washington or to Boston or whatever state we happen to live in, and they vote for the laws on our behalf. Right? We elect them, and they work out those details for us. But occasionally, um, important issues are put directly to the people. Okay. Um, Sometimes an issue is so important that they say, well, we'll let the people vote on this particular issue. Um, the best example I can think of is recently, or at least recently at the time of this recording, Massachusetts was in the process of legalizing marijuana, or at least seeing if the voters wanted to legalize marijuana. And so the issue was put on a ballot question as a ballot question, and people could vote or not vote on it depending on their preference. Well, that ballot question is essentially what a plebiscite is. And Napoleon was a master at using this. Napoleon knew when something was going to be popular or something was going to be unpopular, and when he thought times were right to vote on something, he would often put it directly to the people, and this would give his policy a bit of legitimacy. Okay? So, in other words, when he was sure he was going to win, he would say, okay, well, I'm going by what the people say. And I don't think Napoleon was above stuffing ballot boxes either. The point was he wanted to give his regime the appearance that it was popular. Okay. Now, one group that was unreconciled to the regime were people who were called monarchists. These were people who believed that monarchy was the only legitimate form of government. There were many, many people in France who thought that monarchy was the only true form of government. Of course, there were a lot of other people in France too who thought that monarchs were spawns of Satan. You know, we're 11 years into the revolution, and for many people, it's fixed in their minds that monarchy is associated with tyranny. It's associated with despotism, absolutism, the Louis, all the things that they hated. This was one of many issues that the French were divided on. Well, Napoleon kind of agreed with the sentiments of monarchists, except he thought he should be the monarch. Probably most monarchs were thinking the Louis, the Bourbon family, but Napoleon said, this is a great idea, monarchy. And so he always had felt that the word dictator, that doesn't sound too good. That doesn't sound very legitimate. Can't call yourself a king because half the country hates that. And so he came up with a solution. He had himself crowned emperor. You see, there'd been a lot of bad press about kings, but nobody had said anything bad about emperors, basically because there weren't any. And emperor really just sounds much better than a king anyways, right? It's like a super king. By crowning himself emperor, he hearkened back to older traditions like Caesar or Charlemagne, and so it sounded pretty grand. Napoleon would eventually put this to a plebiscite, by the way, after he'd already crowned himself. But um, he thought that this was a good thing, and he also wanted to outdo all other kings in his ceremony. So it was a traditional way kings were crowned, but Napoleon wanted a super ceremony for a super king. And so at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which is in the middle of Paris, probably the greatest of all the French cathedrals, he had himself crowned king. He invited the Pope. The Pope came up from Rome, something popes had never done for French kings. They had never gone up to crown them, but Napoleon was special. He was the emperor. And so the Pope himself came up and presented Napoleon with the crown. Napoleon also brought back another aspect of the old regime, but of course in modified form, and this was the aristocracy. Of course, France recognized that all people were born equal and there was no more nobility, but Napoleon created kind of a type of aristocracy, but not an aristocracy based on birth. This was an aristocracy based on merit. And basically, the way that you get to be part of this aristocracy, if you want to call it, was called the Legion of Honor, was to have done something noble on the battlefield or in government for the emperor. And it was a big ceremony, a big honor to go up and get pinned with a little piece of metal by Napoleon. So they were almost like a type of aristocracy, a group who had a little extra clout in France. Okay, well, Napoleon is best known as a conqueror, and so I'd like to turn to this aspect of Napoleon's reign. And I should mention that Napoleon had inherited a pretty powerful tool in the army of the Revolution. We saw early on that the army had suffered some setbacks, but the army had really, under the Jacobins especially, the army had really gotten pretty good. And there were certain advantages that the French army had over other armies. During the old regime, the time of the Louis, the time before the Revolution, the common people were discouraged from participating in military matters. The military was regarded as something for that was the sport of kings, right? War is the sport of kings. So, especially going back to feudal times, really only the first, only the second estate, right? The nobles and kings were the only ones who fought in the military. The peasants were, their job during a war was to hide and to try to stay out of the way and not get killed. We saw that under absolutism, peasants had been used, they had been recruited into the army, but they were always just, common foot soldiers. It wasn't until the French Revolution that the Jacobins realized the incredible potential of the people if you get them behind the war effort, right? This idea of patriotism, this idea of nationalism can be very, very powerful. And so not only had they recruited from throughout the nation, we saw that last time they created this gigantic French army, which was very effective, but they'd also used, they'd also instilled this idea of patriotism in people. Unlike other armies who were fighting for a king or sometimes maybe for pay, the French had a citizen soldier. He was a soldier who was defending the fatherland. He was defending France. He was fighting for the nation. He wasn't fighting for a king or a priest or for money. He had a stake in this nation because he was a citizen of it. All right. Furthermore, he knew that he was fighting against aristocrats and kings, those who wanted to put him back in chains, as the slogans of the revolution went. Not only that, but the French army, unlike other armies, tended to promote based on merit. They were, after all, um, the army of the revolution was based on Enlightenment principles, and the idea of merit was very important. Other armies tended to promote based on your rank in the feudal hierarchy. In other words, great barons and nobles got to be generals in other armies. And as you can guess, they're not necessarily the most qualified individuals. Well, not only that, but the French army tended to see itself on crusade. All right. The French army saw itself as spreading the ideas of the revolution. All right. Um, Early on in the war, France was on the defensive. All right. Early on in the war, we saw that the Austrians and the Prussians had crossed into France. But by 1792, with the rise of the Jacobins, the tide had turned, and it had turned in favor of France. And the French had announced that not only were they prepared to defend their own homeland against the kings of Europe, but they were prepared to take the revolution into foreign lands. And so they began to annex various parts of Europe. They began to send their armies into the Austrian Netherlands, what would later become Belgium, into the Netherlands, into Switzerland, into northern Italy. And all of these places were invaded, and oftentimes the French army had citizens in these countries who agreed with them. Maybe bourgeoisie people who agreed with some of the ideas of the revolution, saw this as a great opportunity for freedom in their own countries. Oftentimes, these people would aid them, right? These exciting ideas of the French Revolution were very appealing even outside of France. And these were individuals who maybe saw their chance to oust the nobility. And when the French armies came, these were the people, the local bourgeoisie were often put into positions of authority. Now, in reality, the French didn't really wait for an invitation usually. They tended to just go in and spread these ideas regardless of whether the local inhabitants wanted them or not. And once there, they would often conscript, that is, they would take people into the army, and they would often tax them as well for the price of liberating them. And wherever this army went, both during the time of the Jacobins, during the time of the Directory, and also during the time of Napoleon, they brought the ideas of the revolution with them. All right. And so they profoundly altered the social situation. Many of these places were feudal. I mean, some of these places still had serfdom. These were kind of backwards places, especially as they started to go into Central and Eastern Europe. And everywhere they went, they would abolish feudalism. They would take the church out of power, secularize the church land. Um, they would strip the nobility of its power. And after the time of Napoleon, they would put the Napoleonic Code into place, this pro bourgeoisie set of laws. All right. And so we can see that the French Revolution during this time is being spread outside of France. Well, under Napoleon, this process only accelerated. Napoleon, of course, was a brilliant commander, and Napoleon was able to extend the borders of what was France further and further to the east. Now, Napoleon's strategy, being very brilliant and a cynic, was to divide and conquer. So, at various points, he had different nations against him: Spain or Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, all these pretty big countries. And Napoleon was smart enough to recognize if they all ever cooperated with each other and ganged up on him, they would probably beat him, as good as he was. And so Napoleon was never going to let that happen. Napoleon understood the rivalries and the prejudices of all of these countries, and he was a master at playing them off against each other. So, he might work on the Prussians for a while and get them to sign an alliance with him to fight against Austria, only to break the alliance and then jump in with Austria. And he would do this time and time again, and continuously lied and frustrated his opponents by dividing and conquering. Well, by 1812, Napoleon's empire extended all the way to the borders of Russia, really. Certain parts of Europe had been annexed to France. In other words, they became part of France. So the Netherlands, the country that would become Belgium, northern Italy, these were all France now. In addition to this, there was a second tier of what he called his Grand Empire. And these were countries whose kings had been replaced. They were still nominally independent, but they were essentially dominated by France. And these are countries like Germany and Spain and southern Italy and in Poland. And in these countries, Napoleon put his family members, he had a big family, and so he put his family members as the new kings and queens of all of these different little countries, some of which he actually created. He wasn't above mixing borders around. There was a third tier, and these were countries who were still technically independent, big countries like Prussia and Austria, that Napoleon hadn't actually defeated, but who were so intimidated by Napoleon that they were forced allies. Okay, so he had forced them to become allies of his, and countries like Prussia and Austria still had their own kings, but they were allies of his. And so 1812 was really the high point of Napoleon's career. Almost all of Europe was under his domination, and so he was riding pretty high. But there were still threats to his empire, and the biggest threat was Great Britain. Now, if you know anything about geography, you will know that Britain is an island. And so unlike the rest of Europe, Napoleon could not take his army and, physically invade Britain, not without a navy. And he was frustrated here because Britain, as we know, in the 18th and 19th century, ruled the waves. In other words, they had the biggest and the most powerful navy, and not even Napoleon could defeat it. He tried a couple of times, but the British always won, and Napoleon soon gave up on the hope of physically invading Britain. And so he came up with another strategy, kind of like a reverse boycott, or a boycott, I guess. So France was in control of most of Europe, as we said, and Napoleon created what he called the continental system. Napoleon recognized that trade was the lifeblood of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom. And he contemptuously referred to them as a nation of shopkeepers. And so he was determined that, or he believed anyways, that if he could prevent trade European trade going to Britain, Britain would go broke, they would become desperate, and they would have to make peace with Napoleon because they couldn't live without trade. And so the continental system was set up in 1806 to prevent the countries of Europe from trading with Great Britain. All right. By the way, French merchants did very well in this. The French bourgeoisie did pretty well in this time because they were taking up a lot of the trade that Britain once had. All right. Well, Napoleon had other threats, and this was a threat that nobody had ever really dealt with before. As I mentioned, when Napoleon's armies and the armies of the French went into other countries, they swept away the church. They swept away the nobility, and they promised the liberation of all peoples. Okay, so all of these people suddenly became liberated from nobles and kings and from priests. They became, the power went to the people. But this kind of caused new problems that no one had ever dealt with. Under feudalism, people, as we said, tend to think of themselves by their locality or by their manner or something like that. But once that's swept away, people began to think of themselves as a peculiar nation, a nation, the will of the people, all of those ideas that had been talked about by our friend Rousseau. All right, and this is an important point, so take note of this. All right, you remove the old regime and you begin to start the seeds of nationalism. Now, one of the places Napoleon had real problems was in Spain. When France had invaded Spain, they had removed the old king, who was very corrupt. The Spanish nobles were very corrupt. The church was corrupt. And so Napoleon had put his favorite brother Joseph on the throne. Joseph had brought the ideas of the Enlightenment. And he assumed that, this was going to be a much better government. But even if Joseph was technically better and the old king was corrupt, from the Spanish point of view, he was their king. And even if he was corrupt, he was their corrupt king. And they kind of liked the church. And they, they had their problems with the nobles, but it was better than having Frenchmen rule over them. And so the Spanish rose up against the French. They started to say, well, what are these French people doing here? We're Spaniards. We are a nation too. Why are we being dominated by a foreign nation? And so it was pretty bloody uprisings that began to plague Napoleon in Spain. In other places too, the Italians began to think of themselves as a unique people. Right up until this time, they'd say, "Oh no, I'm Venetian, I'm Genoese, I'm Neapolitan, I'm Sicilian, I'm this, I'm that." But after the time of Napoleon, as he broke down all of these barriers, people began to say, "Well, actually, we're Italian." Same thing in Germany. And so all over Europe, Napoleon began to deal with these nationalist uprisings. And none of them were strong enough to topple him, but it still tied down his forces, trying to put out these little fires. All right. Well, between Britain and nationalism, there was a third threat, and this was going to be the ultimate threat that eventually would bring Napoleon down, and that was Russia. The Russians, and during Napoleon's height, Russia had been cowed into an alliance with Napoleon. Like everybody else, they were terrified of him. And they had agreed to implement the continental system, this system by which the trade of Britain would be prohibited. But the Russians had never really liked this very much. The Tsar um, wasn't a big fan of Napoleon. And in 1812, the Tsar announced to Napoleon that he was no longer going to take part in this continental system, and the alliance was off. Well, Napoleon couldn't let this slide. He couldn't say, okay, well, that's okay for the Russians. We'll just let it slide. Um, no biggie. Because once he did this, naturally other places are going to want to do this. And so he had to make an example of Russia. And so in 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest single army that had ever existed in Europe until that time, a 600,000 man army. And he began his invasion of Russia. Now, the French army had been virtually invincible in Europe. And a big part of their success was the fact that they lived off the land. In other words, they ate the local crops, they ate the food. Europe is pretty densely populated, and there's a lot of farms, and you can do that. But Russia's a whole different beast. Russia is huge. I mean, you can see on this map here the size of France, and you're only seeing, 1/5 of Russia in there. It's absolutely massive. It stretches all the way to the Pacific Ocean. All right? And so it's gigantic distances you're covering. And a lot of the territory doesn't have anything in it. It's just flat grassland. There is no food. Well, anyways, Napoleon's plan wasn't to physically take over all of Russia, send his forces to the Pacific or anything like that. His plan was to go defeat the Russian army very quickly, engage them invade Russia, engage them quickly, defeat them, and force them to surrender. All right? That was Napoleon's technique, to just deliver a gigantic punch in the nose and get them to, resign, quit. But the Russians didn't really play by Napoleon's rules. Rather than come out and fight them immediately, the Russians retreated. They retreated and they retreated, and Napoleon's army had set out in the spring, and it's summer, and they're still retreating back and still retreating back until by September he had gotten to Moscow, which was the capital. And so he was sure at this point he had won, because he now had Moscow. He was now at Moscow, and once you capture the capital, that's the end. But the Russians once again didn't play by his rules. Rather than surrender Moscow to Napoleon, the Russians retreated some more, but in the process, they burnt Moscow to the ground. They burnt their own capital to the ground and retreated further. Well, what was the point of this? Well, the point of this was, rather than give Napoleon a place to spend the winter, which was rapidly coming, the Russians had deprived him of a city to house his troops in, and food, and anything else they would need. And it was now turning into October, and winter came early. And Napoleon realized he had been outfoxed. So he had to announce a retreat. And so his 600,000 man army began its retreat out of Russia, but it was too late. They had wandered thousands of miles into Russia, and the winter was coming. They weren't prepared for it. The snows came. The peasants came out of the woodwork. They knew that they didn't know what was going on, but they knew that these people didn't belong there. Many deserted. Thousands died of cold and hunger. And by the time they limped back into Europe, Napoleon's once grand 600,000 man army was down to only 80,000. Napoleon had no more army left. And it was at this point that Napoleon's enemies realized that he was vulnerable. The Austrians and the Prussians renounced their alliance. The Russians counterattacked. The British, who had never been reconciled to Napoleon, they attacked. And unlike before, where Napoleon had been able to play them off even though he tried, none of them agreed to an alliance with Napoleon. They all agreed to ally with each other until Napoleon was finally defeated. Well, Napoleon was captured, and he was given a pretty lenient terms. Rather than execute him or something like that, they allowed him to retain his title of emperor, but he was going to be the Emperor of Elba, which is a little tiny island the in off the coast of Italy. I'm told it's actually a pretty charming little place. Probably the type of thing none of us would mind being the emperor of. All right, it's kind of in the Riviera, very nice. But of course, for a guy like Napoleon who has all this ambition, he chafed at this turn of circumstances. He hated his life there, and so he planned his escape. And he escaped off the island of Elba, and he landed in France. Now, by this point in 1814, 1815, they were in the process of trying to put Europe back together, including France, and the French king had been put back on the throne, the brother of the king that had been executed, and he immediately sent out his forces to put down Napoleon. But when the French troops came to Napoleon, rather than arrest him, Napoleon looked him in the eye and said, "Will you kill your emperor?" And the troops fell at their knees and said, "Of course not, Monsieur. We love you and we will die for you." And so Napoleon was back in the saddle. Very alarming to Europe. Napoleon's back. He has his army back. And they immediately began to make preparations to fight him. Napoleon given one last chance. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon is defeated again. And this time he is captured, and he's not given such lenient terms. They don't kill him again, but they exile him to the island of St. Helena, which is way out in the middle of the South Atlantic. A very cold, desolate little rock of a place. He's kept under close scrutiny, and he lives out the next 7-8 years of his life, and I believe he dies in 1823 or thereabout. A prisoner on St. Helena. And the death of Napoleon really puts an end to the French Revolution. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about this question. Nationalism, the popular will, was becoming increasingly important in the late 18th and early 19th century, both inside and outside of France. How was Napoleon successful at using it? How was he unsuccessful? Give some examples.